Imagine waking up to the news that a country at war has launched a bold attack, not at the front line, but hundreds of miles deep inside enemy territory. Imagine, too, that this dramatic strike happens just hours before so-called peace talks are set to begin, talks that the world's most powerful government now seems curiously detached from. Are we witnessing a turning point in one of the century's most dangerous conflicts? Or is something even more consequential unfolding behind closed doors? In the dead of night on June 1, 2025, the silence over Russia's remote Irkutsk region was shattered. Dozens of Ukrainian drones, smuggled, hidden, and meticulously coordinated, buzzed over military bases housing some of Russia's most prized warplanes. Explosions ripped through airfields, and satellite images the next morning showed blackened, twisted wreckage. Tu-95 and Tu-22M3 strategic bombers, weapons designed to project terror and power across continents, now laying in ruins. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine had struck a tremendous blow, not just militarily but psychologically, deep within Russia's heartland. International headlines screamed about the attack's audacity, but almost as shocking as the raid itself was the reaction, or rather the lack thereof, from Washington. President Donald Trump, once eager to publicly threaten Moscow or scold Kyiv, was nowhere to be found in the news cycle. No rage tweets, no promises of fire and fury, no rose garden speeches. Instead, a hush. At a moment when Ukraine's nerve and Russia's vulnerability were making waves, the United States, the world's superpower and Ukraine's supposed key backer, seemed to be quietly stepping to the sidelines. And so, as the smell of scorched metal lingered in Russia, and as Ukrainian and Russian diplomats sat at the table in Istanbul under the watchful gaze of the world, one pressing question refused to go away. Is this the moment when the balance of global power, technology, and Western resolve begins to shift? Or has it already shifted, behind our backs? Let's take a step back and look at how we got here. For over 3 years, the Ukraine-Russia war has raged across plains, ruined towns, and global news feeds. What began as a full-scale invasion has settled into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. As of late May 2025, Russia controls approximately 19% of Ukrainian territory. This includes the battered Donbas, Crimea, and swaths of southeastern Ukraine. Skirmishes continue on multiple fronts. Russian forces have made minor but real advances near Sumy and Pokrovsk. In a twist of symbolism, Ukraine hangs on to about 5 square miles inside Russia's Belgorod region, a tiny bulwark, but a defiant one. The human cost is staggering. Credible estimates say that Russian losses have soared past 790,000 killed or wounded. Ukraine's casualties are also enormous, with some figures placing the number around 400,000. These are not just numbers. They represent families, communities, and a generation scarred by war. On the ground, the momentum feels stuck. In the past week alone, Russia gained 33 square miles in Ukraine, while Ukraine clawed back just 2 square miles in Russia. The war map is a checkerboard of stalemate and sudden, bloody swings. But beneath the surface, another war has been unfolding, a technological one. Ukraine, lacking the vast reserves and manpower of its adversary, has bet everything on innovation. Drones, cyber attacks, and intelligence sharing have become the new front lines. The June 1st drone strike wasn't a random gamble. It was the culmination of over a year of planning, logistics, and sheer nerve. Ukrainian operatives, aided by international partners and a shadowy network of smugglers, had managed to slip advanced drones, some the size of a suitcase, others no bigger than a bird, deep into Russian territory. They waited, hidden in barns, forests, and abandoned garages. On the signal, they rose up to hit Russia where it never expected, the heart of its strategic bomber fleet. Zelensky's government wasted no time in celebrating. Ukrainian spokespeople boasted that more than a third of Russia's strategic bombers had been damaged or destroyed. To Kyiv, it was a message. Those who say Putin is winning are wrong, declared Clifford D. May, president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. The Ukrainians are holding their own, even though the support they've been receiving from the United States and other free nations has been woefully insufficient. The attack tapped into a deeper current of frustration, a sense, especially in Ukraine and across Europe, that Western support is not just flagging, but might be running out altogether. This takes us to the diplomatic front. For months, peace talks have sputtered. In May, representatives from Russia and Ukraine met face-to-face in Istanbul for the first time in ages, under the format established by the Trump administration. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in the room, but the Russians sent only lower-level diplomats, signaling that Moscow saw little reason to take the process seriously. What did emerge? Not much. A prisoner exchange agreement allowing severely wounded POWs on both sides to return home, a rare moment of humanity amid the carnage. But there was no breakthrough. Russia came to the table with a list of demands that Ukraine and the West dismissed as unrealistic. Sweeping territorial concessions, recognition of control over occupied regions, and a security regime that would leave Kyiv exposed. The second round of talks, held just after the drone strikes, was even more subdued. Secretary Rubio phoned Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, urging continued direct talks. But according to the State Department, it was Lavrov who initiated the call, a telling sign of who thinks they have the upper hand. Afterward, U.S. officials acknowledged their disappointment, but, as one diplomat put it, they weren't surprised. Russia's maximalist demands made clear. Meaningful negotiation is, for now, wishful thinking. All this played out as President Trump's interest in Ukraine appeared to be evaporating. Officials confided to journalists that the president is increasingly disengaged. His threats to sanction Russia again made headlines, briefly, but after the talks fizzled, there was no follow-up, no show of American resolve. The fallout is profound. President Trump wants a ceasefire. That's possible, but only if he makes good on his threats to put devastating pressure on Putin, argues Clifford May. And Congress is restless. A bipartisan bloc, led by old Ukraine hawks like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, is openly challenging the administration. Their new proposal, slap a jaw-dropping 500% tariff on any country buying Russian energy, hoping to cut off Moscow's war chest. But bills are not bombs, and legislation moves slowly, even as lives are lost daily. Europe is watching nervously. Wolfgang Ischinger, former German ambassador to the U.S., worries aloud. Europe going it alone in Ukraine could be the end of NATO as we know it. Old fears are returning fast. And what of public opinion? Interestingly, it's not just Western governments that are losing patience. Support for peace negotiations is at 61% in Russia and 51% in Ukraine. People on both sides seem exhausted, wary of endless war, yet the militaries grind on. Meanwhile, the economies tell their own story. Ukraine's GDP has shrunk by over 22% since the invasion began. Factories bombed, ports blockaded, millions of workers displaced. Russia, on the other hand, boasts a GDP growth of 5.6% since 2022, yet experts caution that this resilience is unsustainable if the war drags on and sanctions bite deeper. The diplomatic chill from Washington, and the coming legislative tug-of-war in Congress, raises a chilling possibility. Is Ukraine fighting alone? Security analysts like Michael Clark warn, peace talks will continue in a circle until the U.S. gets more heavily involved. But for now, Trump's America seems to be dialing down, not up. Even Krastev, a voice in European policy circles, puts it bluntly. Where Trump is wrong is to see the war in Ukraine primarily as a land dispute of little significance beyond Europe. What's next? Multiple scenarios are now being war-gamed by strategists in Kyiv, Moscow, Brussels, and D.C. First, the grim prospect of a protracted conflict, front lines ossifying, infrastructure crumbling, economies bleeding, Western support eroding over time. There will probably be a ceasefire of some sort in the next 1 to 3 months, predicts General Lord Richard Dannett. But on whose terms, and at what price? Second, a forced settlement. Under American pressure, Ukraine might be pushed into territorial concessions. Crimea, Donbass, a demilitarized zone. In exchange, Kyiv would get security guarantees and economic aid. But would Zelensky's government survive such a deal? Would the Ukrainian people accept it? Or third, the nightmare scenario, a wider war, a miscalculation, or a Russian strike on NATO-linked infrastructure, and suddenly the conflict expands beyond Ukraine's borders, plunging Europe into chaos. Behind all these options is the shadow of American power, or the lack of it. As U.S. involvement seemingly wanes, Russia tests the limits, Ukraine risks everything to stay relevant, and Europe braces for a storm it hoped would never come. And so the world waits. But before we draw any conclusions, there's a crucial question hanging in the air. Is the West, led by the U.S., truly preparing to step away from Ukraine, leaving it to face Russia alone? Or is Washington's silence a calculated move in a much larger geopolitical game? And if the U.S. does retreat, what will be the real cost, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole structure of global security as we know it? In a few moments, we'll dive deeper into the high-stakes decisions facing American and European policymakers, Ukraine's desperate search for leverage, Russia's long-term strategy, and how the outcome could rewire the very foundations of international order. But first, what scenarios are now possible if the West really does step back? And what might that mean for every one of us watching from afar? The world is watching as smoke still lingers above Russian airfields struck by Ukrainian drones, a bold message not just to Moscow but to the whole Western alliance. The United States, once the undisputed conductor of Western support for Ukraine, is now stepping off stage. Europe's anxiety is palpable. Kyiv stands increasingly alone, fighting for survival while the peace table grows cold and the front lines grow hotter. So, with American influence waning and the ground shifting beneath Ukraine's feet, where does the story go from here? Let's look ahead to the future, the possible scenarios that could rewrite the map of Europe and perhaps even redefine what security means in the 21st century. First, consider the scenario that keeps many Ukrainian generals awake at night: a protracted war, stalemate solidifying into a permanent scar on the region. With U.S. arms and funds drying up, Ukraine's arsenal shrinks with every passing month. Russia, battered but resilient, keeps grinding forward, slowly, yard by deadly yard. This is more than just a military issue. Ukraine's economy, already shrunk by nearly a quarter, faces further devastation. Infrastructure crumbles, cities empty, and hope fades in the trenches. The world begins to look away, donor fatigue setting in. As historian Ivan Krastev warns, there is a real danger that the war becomes normalized, a brutal, frozen conflict that Europe tolerates but never truly resolves. But what does that mean in practice? In this slow-motion tragedy, Ukraine could lose more ground, both literally and figuratively. Territorial integrity erodes, as does faith in the promise of Western solidarity. The longer the conflict drags on, the more Kyiv's bargaining power weakens. Even occasional battlefield victories, like the recent drone attacks that shocked the Kremlin, might do little to shift the overall balance. In the background, Russia still controls 19% of Ukraine's land. If the world grows indifferent, the dream of a free, whole Ukraine could slowly slip away. Yet, another path could emerge: a negotiated settlement, hammered out at the peace table, perhaps brokered by exhausted diplomats and nervous neighbors. It's a solution that brings hope and bitter compromise. Under this scenario, Ukraine might be pressured, by both the US and Europe, to accept painful concessions, perhaps ceding Crimea and chunks of the Donbass in exchange for security guarantees and economic aid. On paper, the guns would fall silent. In reality, the wounds might never heal. President Zelensky himself has called such outcomes dangerous illusions, fearing that giving in would simply reward aggression and tempt future land grabs, not just in Ukraine, but across Eastern Europe. As he said recently, any reward for Putin shows that war pays off. That is not just a Ukrainian problem, but a European one. And would such a deal hold? History is littered with broken promises and uneasy truces. The risk of political upheaval inside Ukraine is real. Public opinion polls show a country split, with just over half now supporting negotiations, while the rest demand to fight on. But with support from Washington waning, Kyiv may find itself with few good options. Then there is the most alarming possibility: that the conflict spins out of control, pulling in countries far beyond Ukraine's borders. A miscalculation, a missile going astray, a deliberate escalation, and suddenly NATO is drawn in. The world is just one mistake away from a wider war. Security analyst Michael Clark warns, peace talks will circle endlessly until the U.S. decides to re-engage. But the absence of leadership creates a vacuum, and dangerous things happen in a vacuum. Should Russia seize the moment to test NATO's resolve, perhaps by targeting supply lines in Poland or staging cyber attacks against Western infrastructure, Europe could be staring at its gravest crisis since World War II. General Lord Dannett's prediction of a forthcoming ceasefire is a hopeful one, but as the battlefield sees daily exchanges of fire, hope can feel as fragile as a drone over Russian skies. What if, against expectations, the war's end does not come with a bang, but with the slow, grinding exhaustion of both sides? Ukraine could become another frozen conflict zone, a no-man's land dividing east from west, pulsing with tension for decades to come. The fate of Moldova, Georgia, even the Baltic states, could hang in the balance. As Wolfgang Ischinger, former German ambassador to the U.S., bluntly puts it, if Europe is forced to go it alone in Ukraine, it could mean the end of NATO as we know it. In each of these futures, Europe's security architecture is put to the test. The U.S. retreat under President Trump signals to allies and adversaries alike that the old guarantees can no longer be taken for granted. The ultimate outcome? It's not just Ukraine's borders that hang in the balance, but the very credibility of the Western alliance and the post-Cold War order itself. So what can we, as observers far from the front lines, learn from this crossroads in history? What's the practical takeaway for those watching events unfold from their phones or living rooms? First, understand the cost of disengagement. The U.S. pivot away from Ukraine is not an isolated event. It's part of a broader trend, a moment where great powers reconsider their roles and their responsibilities. For Europe, this is a wake-up call. The era of relying on American muscle is fading. European capitals must invest more in their own defense. For policy watchers and voters alike, the lesson is clear. If you don't pay for your security, you may lose it. The Bundeswehr's rearmament, France's calls for a European defense union, and Poland's rapid arms buildup are not just headlines, they're signs of a continent scrambling to catch up with harsh reality. Second, the Ukraine war is about more than territory or geopolitics. It's a case study in resilience, innovation, and the limits of international solidarity. The relentless creativity shown by Ukrainian forces, smuggling drones deep into Russian territory and striking prized bombers, shows what a determined underdog can achieve. But it also demonstrates the limits of pluck and courage in the absence of sustained support. For anyone in business, technology, or policy, the lesson is the same. Innovation is vital, but alliances and resources are what turn clever ideas into lasting security. Third, be wary of narrative fatigue. Wars that drag on tend to slip from global headlines, their horrors normalized, their stakes obscured. As public attention wanes, so does the political will to act. This is true not just for Ukraine, but for every long-running crisis. To effect real change, citizens need to stay engaged, writing to representatives, supporting NGOs, or simply refusing to let atrocities become background noise. The information you consume and the conversations you spark matter more than you might think. And for the world order, Ukraine is a warning bell. When aggression goes unpunished, or is quietly normalized, other would-be strongmen take note. Moldova, Taiwan, the Baltics, even parts of Africa or the South China Sea. These are not isolated flashpoints, but part of a pattern. How this war ends will send signals, for better or worse, across every time zone. As an ordinary viewer, you have agency. You choose the news you follow, the politicians you support, the products you buy. The fate of Ukraine, and the message sent to all aspiring autocrats of the world, is not predetermined. If public pressure can sway policies, and history shows that it can, then your attention is a force multiplier. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is more hopeful. Ukraine's extraordinary resilience against all odds is a reminder that even small nations can hold the line when the stakes are highest. As Clifford D. May of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies put it, those who say Putin is winning are wrong. The Ukrainians are holding their own, even with less support than they deserve. Courage can buy time, and sometimes that time changes history. And now, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to our central question. With the West stepping back, what truly lies ahead for Ukraine and the global balance of power? The answer is complex, shadowed by risk, but also flickering with possibility. If Washington maintains its distance, Ukraine's future becomes a test case. Can Europe unite and defend its neighbor? Can creativity and grit substitute for industrial might? Or will Russian pressure and Western fatigue redraw the map, sending a signal that borders can be changed by force? We stand at an inflection point, not just for Ukraine, but for the very idea of collective security. If the world shrugs, the floodgates may open elsewhere, Taiwan, the South China Sea, even within Europe's own borders. But if Ukraine's fight galvanizes new resolve, especially from Europe, there remains hope for a renewed, more balanced alliance, one not solely dependent on American leadership. And here's a secret fact, rarely discussed outside expert circles. The covert Ukrainian drone campaign that shocked Russia was made possible by a network of European intelligence services, quietly stepping in as American eyes turned away. This nascent cooperation hints at a future where Europeans take far more responsibility for their own security than at any point since the Cold War, an understated revolution. In short, Ukraine's fate may yet mark the beginning of Europe's strategic adulthood, or its final retreat. The next months will tell. If you found this analysis thought-provoking, share it with someone who needs context, not just headlines. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Which scenario do you think is most likely, and what should the West do now? Subscribe.